The morning sun painted Ouagadougou in shades of gold as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the presidential palace. Unlike other mornings filled with scheduled meetings and diplomatic protocols, this Monday carried a different energy. The young leader of Burkina Faso had made a decision that would shock his security detail and change the course of many lives. "Drive me to the central prison," he told his driver quietly, adjusting his simple brown shirt. No advance notice, no press, just us. The driver's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. "Sir, shouldn't we inform the prison authorities? Prepare security arrangements?" "No," Traoré replied firmly. "I want to see how our people truly live behind those walls. Real conditions, not staged presentations." The black presidential vehicle moved through the bustling streets of the capital, escorted by only 2 unmarked cars. Vendors called out their wares, children played in dusty courtyards, and life continued its rhythmic dance, unaware that their president was about to embark on a mission that would expose the cracks in their justice system. 40 minutes later, the convoy stopped before the imposing gray walls of Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. Razor wire gleamed menacingly atop the concrete barriers, and the air seemed heavy with unspoken stories. The guards at the entrance froze when they recognized the presidential vehicle. "Mr. President," one guard stammered, fumbling with the gate keys. We weren't expecting you, sir." "That's exactly why I'm here," Traoré responded, stepping out of the car. "Open the gates." Prison warden Pascal Ouedraogo came running, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Your Excellency, if we had known, we would have prepared everything properly. The facilities, the prisoners." "I'm not here for preparations," the president interrupted, walking past him. "I'm here to meet the prisoners. Take me to them." The warden's confusion was palpable, but he dared not question further. He led the president through a narrow corridor that echoed with distant sounds, coughing, muffled conversations, the clang of metal doors. The smell hit them immediately. Unwashed bodies, dampness, and the suffocating weight of despair. As they entered the main prison block, a strange quiet fell over the facility. Hundreds of inmates who moments before had been playing cards, lying on thin mattresses, or simply staring at walls, slowly stood up. Their faces registered disbelief, confusion, and something that had been dormant for too long: hope. President Traoré moved among them with genuine curiosity and respect. He shook hands, asked questions, and listened to their stories with an attention that surprised even his own security detail. "How long have you been here?" he asked a middle-aged man. 3 years, Mr. President. Theft charges." "Do you have family?" "A wife and 2 children, sir. They visit when they can afford transport." The president nodded thoughtfully and moved on, making mental notes of each conversation. Some men spoke boldly about their cases, others remained guarded, and a few simply wept at the unexpected attention from their nation's leader. For over an hour, Traoré walked through the cramped cells, sat on concrete floors, and shared moments of human connection with men society had forgotten. But it was in a small, darker cell at the far end of the block that his attention was caught by a figure who hadn't stood with the others. The man sat quietly in the corner, his head bowed, hands clasped loosely in his lap. His beard was unkempt, his clothes worn thin, and his entire posture spoke of someone who had surrendered to fate. Unlike the others who had rushed to see their unexpected visitor, this man remained motionless, as if he had given up on surprises long ago. President Traoré approached slowly and stopped in front of the cell. The man looked up gradually, his eyes meeting the president's with a mixture of wariness and profound sadness. There was something different about this prisoner, not the hardened look of a career criminal, but the broken spirit of someone who had lost everything. "What is your name?" the president asked gently. "Emmanuel," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" 7 years, sir." The number hung in the air like a weight. 7 years. The president studied Emmanuel's face, noting the absence of anger or bitterness that might be expected. Instead, he saw something that touched him deeply, the quiet dignity of someone who had endured injustice with grace. "What were you accused of?" Traoré continued. Emmanuel swallowed hard before responding. "They said I stole money from my employer, but I didn't do it, sir. I worked for that man for many years. He needed someone to blame, and I was convenient." As Emmanuel spoke, his voice gained strength, as if talking to someone who genuinely listened was awakening something within him that had been dormant for years. The president listened intently, his experienced eye reading between the lines of the story being told. The conversation would continue, but already, President Ibrahim Traoré knew that this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. In this forgotten corner of an overcrowded prison, justice was about to find its voice through the most unexpected of messengers. The silence in Emmanuel's cell was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of prison life continuing around them. President Traoré remained standing before the cell, his eyes never leaving Emmanuel's face as the man continued his story. "I had no lawyer," Emmanuel said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "No one to speak for me. When they brought me to court, I stood alone while my former boss sat with his expensive attorneys. The judge barely looked at me before pronouncing the sentence, 15 years. The president felt a cold anger building in his chest. "Tell me about your employer. What was his name?" "Laurent Guéret. He owned a logistics company where I worked as a clerk for 8 years. I was honest, punctual, never missed a day. But then his nephew needed a job." Emmanuel's voice trailed off, the pain of betrayal still fresh after all these years. President Traoré turned to the warden, who had been standing nervously behind him. "Bring me this man's file. I want every document, every piece of evidence, every record of his trial." "Sir, it might take some time to locate." "You have until sunset." The president cut him off sharply. "And I want to know who the arresting officers were, who the judge was, and I want a complete record of the investigation." As the warden hurried away, Traoré returned his attention to Emmanuel. "Why didn't you appeal? Surely there were options." Emmanuel's laugh was bitter, but not angry. "With what money, sir? My wife left me within the first year. She took our children and moved back to her family's village. She said she couldn't bear the shame. I had no money for appeals, no connections, no voice that anyone wanted to hear." The president listened to this catalog of abandonment with growing resolve. This wasn't just about one man's suffering. It was about a system that had failed catastrophically, leaving the vulnerable to rot while the powerful escaped consequences. "Have you had any visitors in 7 years?" he asked. "No one," Emmanuel replied simply. "I wrote letters for the first 2 years, but they were never answered. Eventually, I stopped trying. I learned to find peace in solitude." That evening, President Traoré sat in his office at the Ministry of Justice, a thick file spread across his desk. What he read made his blood boil. Emmanuel's case was a textbook example of judicial corruption and systematic failure. The investigation had been cursory, the evidence circumstantial at best, and the trial had lasted less than 2 hours. Most damning of all was the revelation about the presiding judge, Justice Amadou Diabre, who had been dismissed from his position 3 years earlier for accepting bribes. The man who had condemned Emmanuel to 15 years in prison was himself a criminal. The president picked up his phone and dialed his justice minister. "Dufresne, I need you here immediately. Cancel whatever you're doing." Minister Dufresne arrived within the hour, finding his president pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "Sir, you asked to see me urgently?" "I visited the central prison today," Traoré began without preamble. "I met a man named Emmanuel who has been rotting in a cell for 7 years for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit." He handed the minister the file. "Read this, all of it. Tell me how our justice system could fail so completely." As Dufresne reviewed the documents, his face grew pale. The case was indeed a travesty built on fabricated evidence, processed by a corrupt judge and defended by no one. Laurent Gourret had used his wealth and connections to frame an innocent man, and the system had eagerly obliged. This is terrible, the minister admitted. But sir, the conviction stands. We cannot simply... Cannot what? The president interrupted. Cannot seek justice, cannot correct our mistakes, cannot admit that we have imprisoned an innocent man for 7 years of his life? The minister fell silent, recognizing the futility of arguing with his determined leader. Here's what we're going to do, Traoré continued. Tomorrow you will assemble an independent review team. I want prosecutors, defense attorneys, and human rights observers. They will re-examine this case from the beginning, and I want Laurent Gourret investigated. If he framed Emmanuel, I guarantee he's done it to others. Over the next 48 hours, the review team worked around the clock. They discovered that Gourret's company had filed similar accusations against 5 other employees over the past decade. In each case, the accused had been poor, had no legal representation, and had been quickly convicted. The pattern was unmistakable. Even more disturbing was the discovery that several key pieces of evidence in Emmanuel's case had been fabricated. Signature analysis revealed that Emmanuel's supposed confession had been forged, and the financial records that allegedly showed his theft had been doctored. When the team presented their findings, President Traoré felt a mixture of vindication and fury. Emmanuel had indeed been framed, his life destroyed by a wealthy man's greed and a corrupt system's indifference. We will not only free him, the president declared, we will ensure that justice is finally served, and we will make sure this never happens again to anyone in our country. The next morning, President Traoré returned to the prison, but this time he brought media cameras and a legal team. The nation was about to witness something unprecedented, their president personally righting a terrible wrong. The media convoy arrived at Ouagadougou Central Prison as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Reporters, cameramen, and government officials followed President Traoré through the now familiar corridors, their footsteps echoing with purpose and anticipation. Word had spread throughout the prison that something extraordinary was about to happen. Emmanuel sat in his cell, unaware of the commotion building around him. 7 years of disappointment had taught him not to hope for miracles. When he heard footsteps approaching his cell, he barely looked up, expecting another routine inspection or perhaps a new cellmate. "Emmanuel?" came the familiar voice that had haunted his thoughts for 3 days. This time, when he looked up, Emmanuel saw not just President Traoré, but cameras, legal officials, and faces filled with purpose. His heart began to race, but years of emotional protection made him hesitant to believe what his eyes were telling him. "Emmanuel," the president said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence of the prison block, "I have read your file. You were not only wrongly accused, you were betrayed by a system that should have protected you." The cameras captured every word, every emotion, as prisoners throughout the facility pressed against their cell bars to witness this unprecedented moment. "I'm sorry," President Traoré continued, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "Our nation failed you. Our courts failed you. But today we begin to make it right." He turned to the legal team beside him. "Emmanuel, you are going home. Today." For a moment, Emmanuel couldn't process the words. Going home? After 7 years, the concept seemed as foreign as flying. His legs felt weak, and he gripped the cell bars for support. This is real?" he whispered, tears beginning to stream down his face. "Yes," the president replied firmly. "You are a free man." As the cell door swung open for the final time, Emmanuel stepped into the corridor on unsteady legs. The other prisoners erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the concrete walls in a thunderous celebration of justice finally served. Many of them wept openly, seeing in Emmanuel's freedom a glimmer of hope for their own situations. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered. News of the president's dramatic intervention had spread throughout Ouagadougou, and people had come to witness this moment of justice. As Emmanuel emerged into the sunlight, Squinting after years of dim artificial lighting, the crowd burst into applause. Reporters thrust microphones toward him. "How do you feel? What will you do now? Do you harbor anger toward those who wronged you?" Emmanuel stood quietly for a moment, overwhelmed by the attention, the noise, the freedom. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the crowd. "I don't know how to feel," he said honestly. "I have no family, no home, no job. But for the first time in 7 years, I have hope, and perhaps that's enough to start with." President Traoré placed a protective hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "You are not alone," he declared, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Our nation owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we will do everything in our power to help you rebuild your life." True to his word, the president personally drove Emmanuel to the presidential guest house, where he would stay until proper arrangements could be made. For Emmanuel, the simple luxury of a hot shower, clean clothes, and a meal at a real table felt like stepping into another world. That evening, in the comfortable sitting room of the guest house, President Traoré sat across from Emmanuel, 2 cups of tea between them. The formal distance of president and citizen had given way to something more profound. 2 men sharing a moment of human connection. "Tell me about your dreams," Traoré said. "Before all this happened, what did you want from life?" Emmanuel smiled for the first time in years, a genuine, unguarded expression. "I wanted to be a teacher. I studied education before I took the job with Goret. I loved the idea of helping children learn, of giving them tools to build better lives." "Then that's what you'll do," the president said decisively. "We'll arrange for you to complete your education, and when you're ready, you'll have a position in our school system." But Traoré had an even larger vision forming in his mind. Over the following days, as Emmanuel slowly adjusted to freedom, the president was working on something unprecedented, a national audit of the prison system. If this happened to Emmanuel, he told his cabinet, how many others are suffering similar injustices? How many innocent people are rotting in our prisons while we congratulate ourselves on law and order? The cabinet meeting was tense. Several ministers worried about the implications of such a comprehensive review. What if they found hundreds of wrongful convictions? What if the public lost faith in the entire justice system? "Then we fix it," Traoré replied simply. "All of it, no matter how painful, no matter how embarrassing, no matter how expensive. Justice delayed is justice denied, and we have denied it for too long." Within a week, President Traoré announced the creation of Operation Justice Light, a nationwide review of all prisoners who had served more than 5 years, with special attention to those who had lacked legal representation. Emmanuel would not just be a beneficiary of this new commitment to justice, he would be its symbol, and, eventually, one of its leaders. The transformation was beginning, not just for Emmanuel, but for an entire nation ready to confront its failures and build something better. 3 months after his liberation, Emmanuel stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark jacket, he bore little resemblance to the broken man who had emerged from prison. But it wasn't just his appearance that had transformed. There was a new strength in his voice, a clarity of purpose that commanded attention. "I speak to you today, not as a victim," he began, his words carrying across the silent hall, "but as a witness to what happens when power operates without accountability, and as proof of what becomes possible when leaders choose courage over convenience." In the front row, President Traoré listened with pride as Emmanuel addressed the law students. This was Emmanuel's idea, to share his story directly with those who would shape Burkina Faso's legal future. It was part of a broader transformation that had captured international attention. Operation Justice Light had exceeded everyone's expectations, revealing systematic failures throughout the justice system. In 6 months, the review teams had examined over 2,000 cases and identified 347 prisoners who had been wrongfully convicted or held beyond their sentences. Each case was a story of broken families, lost opportunities, and human dignity trampled by a system that had forgotten its fundamental purpose. But perhaps the most significant discovery had been the pattern of corruption surrounding Laurent Guéret and others like him. The investigation had uncovered a network of wealthy businessmen who had systematically used false accusations to eliminate inconvenient employees, competitors, or critics. Judges had been bought, evidence fabricated, and witnesses intimidated. Guéret himself now sat in the same prison where Emmanuel had spent 7 years facing charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Emmanuel, who had visited his former employer to deliver a message of forgiveness that had moved even the hardened businessman to tears. "Justice is not revenge," Emmanuel had told Guéret through the prison bars. "It's the hope that others won't suffer, as we both have. You in your greed, and me in my innocence." President Traoré had been so moved by this encounter that he appointed Emmanuel as special advisor on prison reform and human rights, a position that had never existed before, but had quickly become essential to the government's transformation efforts. Emmanuel's work took him across the country, from the largest facilities in major cities to small rural jails that had operated without oversight for decades. In each location, he brought not just the authority of his government position, but the credibility of someone who had lived the reality of wrongful imprisonment. In the northern town of Dori, he discovered a man who had been forgotten in a cell for 12 years without trial. In Bobo Dioulasso, he found 3 women who had been imprisoned for economic crimes. That investigation revealed to be simple poverty. Each case strengthened his resolve and deepened his understanding of how justice could be corrupted by indifference. But Emmanuel's most important contribution was his insistence that reform must go beyond simply freeing the wrongfully convicted. He advocated for comprehensive support systems, job training, psychological counseling, family reunification services, and legal aid programs that would prevent such failures in the future. Freedom is not just opening a cell door, he explained to a gathering of international human rights observers. It's ensuring that people have the tools to build meaningful lives and that the system that failed them is rebuilt to serve justice rather than power. President Traoré had embraced this vision completely. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso became a model for judicial reform across West Africa. The country established legal aid clinics in every region, implemented mandatory training for judges and prosecutors, and created an independent prison oversight board with Emmanuel as its chair. The changes were not without political cost. Some powerful figures who had benefited from the old system pushed back, accusing the president of being naive and Emmanuel of being vindictive. But public support remained strong, especially as more families were reunited and more injustices corrected. 1 year after his liberation, Emmanuel returned to the Ouagadougou Central Prison for a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The facility had been completely renovated, with improved living conditions, educational programs, and legal aid services. Most importantly, a new plaque hung at the entrance. "Justice delayed is justice denied, never again." Standing before the assembled crowd of officials, former prisoners, and their families, Emmanuel reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. "A year ago, I sat in a cell believing that the world had forgotten me," he said. "I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten. It simply wasn't listening. Today, we celebrate not just my freedom, but our collective commitment to ensuring that every voice is heard, every case is fairly judged, and every person is treated with the dignity they deserve." President Traoré took the podium after Emmanuel, but his words were brief. "Sometimes," he said, "a leader's greatest achievement is learning when to follow. Emmanuel has taught our nation more about justice than any law book ever could. The work continues, but the foundation is strong." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Emmanuel remained for a moment in front of his former cell, now converted into a library. Through the barred window, afternoon sunlight streamed across books on law, human rights, and social justice. Tools for future generations to build a more just society. Walking away from the prison for the final time as a free man, Emmanuel carried with him not bitterness for the years lost, but hope for the lives that would be saved by the changes they had fought to implement. Justice, he had learned, was not a destination, but a journey, one that required constant vigilance, courage, and the willingness to listen to voices that others might ignore. The sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as Burkina Faso continued its own journey toward a more just tomorrow.
That morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, not as a politician, but as a builder of destiny, and declared the unthinkable: the birth of the Burkindi Business Center, a 500 billion megaproject in the heart of West Africa. My fellow Burkinab, he said, today we do not just lay foundations of concrete, we lay foundations of sovereignty. Across the world, headlines blinked in disbelief. How could a landlocked, often overlooked country suddenly announce Africa's first smart city? How could Burkina Faso, so long framed as a dependent state, dare to compete with Dubai, Lagos, and Singapore? They didn't understand, because they never believed Africa was capable of this. But on June 6th, a skyline began to rise where others expected silence. Bulldozers rolled not under foreign flags, but national ones. Drones hovered not for surveillance, but for coordination. And 15 towers, a 35-story Burkindi tower, and 2,000 offices were not symbols of vanity, they were blueprints of freedom. This is not just urban development. This is the redefinition of African power. Not through tanks, but through towers. Not through protests, but through projects. Burkina Faso has begun to speak in steel and glass. And the world is not ready for what it's hearing. Welcome to a new chapter. Not of apology, but of architecture. Africa is not waiting. Africa is building. And Traoré, he just broke ground on the future. This is not the first foundation Traoré has laid. Just 2 years ago, in July 2023, he stood before the same people, not with blueprints but with resolve, and declared war on dependency, corruption, and the ghosts that fed off Africa's buried gold. Back then, he was mocked. They called him idealistic, reckless, transitional figure. They said he wouldn't last a year, but Burkina Faso remembered. It remembered how Thomas Sankara tried to industrialize with dignity and was gunned down. How Gaddafi dreamed of a gold-backed dinar and was buried beneath lies. How Lumumba stood for sovereignty and was erased from the map. And now a generation raised on that trauma is building what their heroes never got to finish. The Burkindi Business Center is not just a project. It is a correction. It is Sankara's tractors, Gaddafi's financial independence, Lumumba's African pride, resurrected in reinforced concrete and solar grids. In 2020, Traoré expelled foreign military advisors, canceled corrupt mining contracts, and forced international corporations to renegotiate or leave. That wasn't just resistance. It was rehearsal. Now, those same ideals have become policy. In Ouaga 2000, where Burkindi rises, the soil remembers the decades of neglect, the promises never fulfilled, the budgets siphoned off to Geneva, Paris, and Brussels. No more. This land now answers to a different logic, the logic of legacy. And it is no accident that this project launches not with Western banks, but with African engineers, African capital, African dreams. What began as defiance has matured into design. And as Burkindi takes form, so too does a new philosophy. We no longer protest injustice, we outbuild it. Traoré did not come to fix an old system. He came to bury it. In its place, a tower now rises, not in memory of the past, but in mastery of the future. The Burkindi Business Center isn't just a development zone. It is a deliberate act of architecture as ideology. Spanning over 600 square meters in the capital's Ouaga 2000 district, this smart city project is more than an assembly of concrete and glass. It's a message. A declaration written in steel. 15 towers, each rising 15 stories. A 35-story Burkindi tower, the tallest structure in West Africa, crowned not by a corporate logo, but by the national crest of Burkina Faso. 2,000 office spaces. 700 smart apartments. A mall, a health center, a daycare, gyms, public squares. Solar power infrastructure. AI-integrated logistics and security systems. High-speed connectivity not imported from Silicon Valley, but developed in partnership with Pan-African tech coalitions. This is what a Pan-African revolution looks like when it puts on a suit. Burkindi is not a copy of Dubai. It's not a replica of Singapore. It's a city where mothers can walk their children to school without fear. Where a young coder from Dori can pitch her startup to investors from Bamako, Lagos, or Kigali, without leaving the continent. Every blueprint echoes a deeper philosophy. African modernity is not contradiction, it is convergence. This is a new vocabulary of infrastructure, where the shape of a building reflects the shape of a dream. And Traoré's dream is massive. For decades, African cities have been sites of extraction, not expansion, built around embassies and foreign NGOs, designed for the comfort of outsiders, not the dignity of citizens. Burkindi rejects that model entirely. Its apartments aren't priced in euros. Its contracts aren't denominated in dollars. The energy doesn't depend on colonial grids. Even the name, Burkindi, comes from local dialect. It means our strength. This is not about attracting the world. It is about centering the continent. And that shift, while physical, is also philosophical. Under Traoré's leadership, the idea of what a capital city should be is changing. Ouagadougou is no longer a place where decisions are handed down. It's where futures are handed back. Burkindi will host regional summits, PAN, African business incubators, and digital economy forums. It's designed to be not just Burkina Faso's beating heart, but the brain of a new Africa. International observers scramble to categorize it. Is it Afrofusion? Is it national? Is it military populism? No. It's something more radical: functional sovereignty. Traoré is proving that sovereignty isn't a speech, it's a supply chain. You don't gain independence by renaming ministries. You gain it by laying fiber optic cable, by reducing rent dependence, by housing civil servants in state-owned towers instead of leased French compounds. And Burkindi does exactly that. Currently, Burkina Faso spends vast sums renting government office space. Traoré's model is simple: build once, own forever. The project is structured to absorb state functions, reduce long-term budget strain, and redirect savings toward healthcare, education, and defense. It's not ideology, it's math. It's not theory, it's planning. But what makes Burkindi revolutionary isn't only what it builds, it's who builds it. Led by the National Bureau of Major Projects and Sonatuar, in collaboration with Africa, Gulf International, and Castor Africa, the project is 100% African managed. No World Bank conditionalities. No foreign advisory boards. This is the clearest rupture yet with the post-colonial development model. And for young Africans, especially in the Sahel, it is a shockwave of possibility. In Bobo, Dioulasso, civil engineering students are already sketching their own designs for secondary smart hubs. In Niamey and Bamako, youth forums ask, what will our Burkindi look like? Because what Traoré has sparked isn't just a physical build, it's a psychological blueprint. Burkindi is proof that Africa can define luxury without mimicry. That sovereignty is scalable. That smart doesn't mean Western. It means in African timelines. And timelines matter. The full complex is scheduled for completion by 2029, with partial buildings operational as early as 2027. 4 years to shift a skyline, 5 to shift an identity. It's bold. It's dangerous to those who profit from African stagnation. Already, whispers have begun. Where's the money coming from? Is this sustainable? Will it provoke conflict? The same questions they asked about Sankara's tractors, about Gaddafi's Pan-African Fund, about any African initiative that dares to dream outside prescribed margins. But Burkindi isn't waiting for permission. The foundation has already been poured. And it's deeper than concrete. It's built on a belief system. That Africa doesn't need escape, it needs equipment. That the solution to migration is not a wall in Europe, but a tower in Ouagadougou. That the best way to silence doubters is not to argue, but to build so loud they can't ignore you. By the 15th minute, we realize this is no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It's about the continent watching and asking itself, what are we waiting for? Because while the old world debates, Burkindi is already rising. Now imagine if it had failed. Imagine if June 6, 2025 had been the end, not the beginning. If the Burkindi Business Center was just another dream broken before it took shape. If the cranes stood still, the dust settled, and the maps returned to grayscale. Imagine a press release from Paris will urge calm and constitutional order. Imagine Washington calling for stability while freezing African infrastructure bonds. Imagine investors pulling out, equipment abandoned, workers, empty foundations, half-built futures. Ouagadougou would go quiet not from peace, but from pressure. Burkina Faso would again be framed as unstable, too bold for its size, too proud for its position. Burkina would be archived as a missed opportunity, and Traoré. He would be labeled reckless, dangerous. A cautionary tale. That is the world one political signature away. One IM. Drone strike disguised as diplomacy away. But it didn't happen. Because the resistance isn't just against tanks and treaties. It's against forgetfulness. Traoré didn't survive June 6th because of military might. He survived because the people remembered. When word of sabotage circulated, market women surrounded construction sites, forming human walls with nothing but their bodies and brooms. "You will not take this from us," one said. "We've buried too many dreams already." Young engineers refused to abandon blueprints. "We will code from home if we must," they said. Construction crews worked through the night, not out of duty, but out of belief. Across the Sahel, something sacred was taking root, a refusal to unbuild. Because Burkina was not just concrete, it was promise. Dignity. Proof. In Bobo Dioulasso, radio stations broadcast the architectural plans on air. "So no one can steal the vision," they said. "Even if they try to stop the hands, they can't erase the idea." Children in Kaya drew the tower with crayons. One wrote in the corner, "My future is 35 floors tall." Even elders, those who'd seen decades of disappointment, spoke differently. One griot whispered, "We have seen palaces collapse. But this has people's breath in it." This wasn't just a project anymore. It was a ritual. It was what Sankara meant when he said, "Let us dare to invent the future." And the people dared. Loudly, quietly, together. So when the first test came, political threats, media slander, blocked funds, the people didn't panic. They tightened their circle. They guarded the sites. They raised flags not just of Burkina Faso, but of the AES, of Pan-African unity, of black sovereignty. And from that convergence rose a lesson for the world. You cannot stop a people who have remembered what they are capable of. You cannot cancel blueprints drawn in blood and belief. You cannot unbuild a nation once it has begun to see itself clearly. Burkina is not just a smart city. It is a spell cast against erasure, a monument to memory, a fortress of vision. And if the West thinks it can outspend, outmaneuver, or outweigh it, they are not watching closely enough. Because in Africa today, the greatest power is not military. It is memory sharpened into momentum. And on that June morning, it moved faster than fear. What if Burkina is more than a project? What if it's a prophecy, finally made tangible? Because to build like this in Africa, without permission, without apology, without Western oversight, is not just radical, it's revolutionary. It questions everything the world thought it knew about the continent. For centuries, Africa was told to wait. Wait for stability, wait for aid, wait for investors. But Burkina refuses the logic of waiting. It moves. It breathes its own timeline. And that shift, silent, seismic, threatens more than geopolitics. It threatens architecture itself, because Burkina is not shaped by colonial grids. It doesn't mimic Paris boulevards or London business parks. It's not aspirational, it's ancestral. The tower's curves echo Sahel dunes. The plazas mirror village courtyards. The public gardens follow the logic of sacred groves. This is African futurism rooted in African memory. But memory alone doesn't pour concrete. It takes design. Energy. That's why Burkina has its own microgrid, its own data systems, its own internal trade circuits. It is wired to be independent. Functionally, symbolically, and digitally. This is not just resilience, it's resistance by design. When global powers cut infrastructure loans, Burkina responded with modular budgets and decentralized planning. When foreign media mocked its ambitions, Burkina answered with drone footage of steel rising under African sun. When economists warned of overreach, Burkina replied with job sites buzzing, engineers drafting, children sketching the skyline in school. It flipped the script. And suddenly, other nations looked up. In Bamako, young planners proposed their own towers, Djoliba Tech Valley. In Niamey, urban cooperatives drafted uranium commons, a civic district built on reclaimed mining wealth. The AES, once seen as a military bloc, was morphing into something stranger, deeper, an architectural alliance. Not of defense, but of design. And it was terrifying to those who thrived on African dysfunction. Because what happens when a continent learns to build itself? Not just physically, but politically. What happens when sovereignty becomes structural? when independence is not declared in speeches but embedded in zoning codes. Burkindi dares to answer. It says, "We are no longer asking what is possible. We are asking what is overdue." And that question reverberates beyond borders. It reaches Lagos, Nairobi, Kinshasa. It whispers to diasporas in New York, Paris, Sao Paulo. Return is not a direction. It is a design language. Traoré knows this isn't just urbanism, it's pedagogy. It teaches every bricklayer, every apprentice, every citizen, you are not the recipient. You are the architect. You do not inherit identity, you build it. In the shadow of Burkindi Tower, power no longer wears suits or medals, it wears work boots. And that may be Burkindi's most radical lesson. The future of Africa will not be negotiated, it will be constructed, floor by floor, dream by dream, by those who dare to draw their own skyline. They thought Burkindi would be a building. But the real twist is this: it's a mirror. A 35-story reflection not of what Burkina Faso is, but of what Africa remembers it once was. They expected concrete. What they got was confession. Burkindi doesn't just challenge skylines, it challenges time. Because when Traoré laid the foundation, he wasn't just breaking ground, he was breaking a cycle of imported futures, of plans drafted in foreign languages, of sovereignty outsourced to donors, consultants, and diplomatic cables. He shattered it. And in its place rose something ancient in new skin. The name itself, Burkindi, was not chosen for branding. It means our strength in Moray, a language older than borders, older than the CFA franc, older than France itself. You cannot translate that kind of strength, you can only live it. Burkindi is not just about jobs or walls or shopping malls. It's about justice, structural justice, generational justice. Because every floor of Burkindi Tower echoes with the names of those who never saw their dreams cast in steel. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, Cabral, Nkrumah. They never built this, but they made it possible. And that is the sacred paradox of African revolution. It often begins with martyrs, but it matures with masons. For every visionary gunned down, there are 10,000 builders rising quietly. Burkindi is the temple they never got to finish. And now Traoré builds it, not as a prophet, but as a prism. He refracts pain into plans, memory into masonry, betrayal into blueprint. That is why the project has faced sabotage attempts, cybertax, diplomatic backlash. Not because of its scale, but because of its symbolism. Because Burkindi dares to suggest that Africa does not need to be rescued. It needs to be remembered. Its walls say we are not broken, we are unfinished. And the West, for all its satellites and sanctions, cannot read that inscription. Because it's written in griot rhythm, in mango shade, in the quiet dignity of elders who never left, who always knew the soil could still answer. And that, above all, is what Burkindi restores the voice of the land. This is no longer just a smart city. It's a sacred site, a skyline that kneels only to the ancestors, a complex where infrastructure meets invocation. And so, the world asks, will Burkindi survive the pressure? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, can the old world survive Burkindi? Can an architecture of control survive an architecture of return? Because Burkindi does not just rise, it reclaims. And Traoré, he is not the end of the story. He is the moment it changes course. So now the question turns to you, not just as a viewer, but as a witness. What will you carry from this? Will Burkindi be just another headline, a video you watched and scrolled past? Or will it be a seed, a signal that something sacred is happening and it demands your voice? Because this story does not end with Traoré cutting a ribbon. It begins with what happens after. What happens when a generation realizes that sovereignty is not a speech, it is a skyline. That independence is not a flag, it is fiber, optic cables, local jobs, and the courage to build without permission. That dignity is not donated, it is designed. You are not just watching Burkina Faso build a city. You are watching Africa remember how to build itself. The old world will try to ignore it, contain it, explain away. But Burkindi does not ask to be understood, it asks to be honored. By the young girl in Bamako who sees herself as an architect now. By the migrant son in Paris who hears his mother say, "Come home, there's work here." By the street vendor in Abidjan who now dreams of renting an office in Ouagadougou. By you, wherever you are, choosing to speak this story aloud. This is not just about bricks. This is about breath. The breath of a continent that refuses to suffocate under other people's futures. Burkindi is not a miracle. It is a method. It is a call to other African capitals not to compete, but to converge. Not to copy, but to claim. And to the world, it is a warning Africa is no longer waiting. It is writing. It is welding. It is wiring its destiny with or without your cameras. So speak this story. Translate it. Carry it. Because long after this video ends, Burgundy will still be rising. And the question is, will you rise with it? The age of requests is over. The age of return has begun. Africa is not coming. Africa. And the skyline is only the beginning.